Russia has been hard-pressed to find real allies for quite some time now. And that problem just got worse after the Russians went in to Ukraine in 2014 and then the full-scale invasion in 2022. And so if you were to say, who's on Russia's side right now, it's basically Iran and North Korea, with the Chinese there in a no-limit strategic partnership. And then the Russians have little toeholds elsewhere, in Africa until recently, in Venezuela, some holdovers from the Russian role in Cuba. But we're not looking at a Russia that enjoys a great deal of influence in many parts of the world. And what happened in Venezuela is in some ways a setback, because the Russians and the Chinese, for that matter, had invested in the country and had good relations with Maduro. And so the Russian relationship, the provision of air defenses to Venezuela, for example, all of that proved rather useless. And so this is yet another setback for Russia. How big a setback? Not a big one. In some ways, I think what Trump has done is in Venezuela is probably making Putin and Xi Jinping happy for two different reasons. One is it's caused a great deal of division inside the United States and inside the Atlantic Alliance. Everybody is now scratching their head and saying, what is Trump doing? What is he going to do in Greenland? And then the other is, in some ways, Trump's intervention in Venezuela and his reinstatement of the Monroe Doctrine plays into the desires of both Russia and China to have regional spheres of influence. He is in some ways saying, hey, might makes right. The powerful do what they want. The weak do what they must. Those are the kinds of statements and behaviors that make Beijing and Moscow pretty comfortable.
Yeah, Bloomberg reported that Iran has sold missiles to Russia worth almost $3 billion. It emphasizes to what extent their military cooperation is deep. How events in Iran could directly and indirectly influence Russia-Ukraine war?
Well, I think that the developments that we've seen unfold in the Middle East represent very serious setbacks for Russia. It's in part because of Iran, and Russia basically didn't lift a finger during the Israeli attack, which Donald Trump joined in the final hours. Russian air defenses were easily taken down by Israeli aircraft and electronic countermeasures. And as a consequence, I think Russia lost a foothold and a level of influence in the Middle East. And then you had Syria, with the toppling of the Syrian regime. The new government in Damascus has been a serious setback for Russia, for Iran, for their influence in the region. And now you have unrest in Iran that could perhaps lead to the downfall of the Islamic Republic. I think we're as close to that outcome as we've ever been. And that could mean a breach in the relationship with Russia. It could mean the end of arms sales to Russia. Does it mean the end of Russia's war against Ukraine? No, I don't think so. I think one of the things that we've seen going back to 2014 and 2022 is that if there's a weak link in the strategy of containing Russia, it's the sanctions. And in a globalized world where Russia has support from North Korea, from China, where it can trade with Turkey and Central Asia and Georgia and other countries, it's very hard to shut down the Russian economy and to prevent items that have military applications from going in. So a toppling of the regime in Iran would be a big setback for Russia. I don't see it as having an immediate and huge impact on what Russia is doing in Ukraine.
When it comes to broader perspective, what could happen if current Iranian regime would fall? What positive and negative geopolitical implications, not in Ukraine, not in Russia, in the world in general, do you see?
Well, there's a good scenario and there's a bad scenario. The good scenario is that the regime falls and that a real troublemaker in the Middle East is gone. And let's be honest here. The Islamic Republic was established in 1979 during the revolution, toppled the Shah, and for the next many decades, right? 79 until 2025, that's a pretty long run. Iran has been a real troublemaker, supporting proxies in Iraq, in Syria, Hamas in Gaza, proxies in Yemen that have caused real trouble. It's what we call the axis of resistance. Unfortunately, that axis has been dismantled, and now Iran itself may disappear. And we also know that Iran has been a major state sponsor of terrorism, with attacks carried out in many far-flung places. So I don't think you're going to find a lot of countries around the world that are deeply upset if this regime falls. The downside risk is what happens should it fall. Will there be some kind of peaceful transition? Will there be an opposition that comes to power? Or does Iran turn into something like a failed state and look more like Iraq after the US invasion, or Syria after the civil war, with all kinds of regional powers trying to take advantage of it, with different ethnic groups inside the country trying to separate from Iran? Who knows what could transpire? And I'm guessing that one of the reasons that the Trump administration is being careful about the potential use of force is the idea that if there is to be change, or the change really does need to come from within, it needs to be organic, and that an Iranian regime that's toppled by the United States, with an opposition that isn't somehow attached to the United States, I think is much less stable than one in which there is a natural grassroots revolution that gets rid of a regime that has not delivered for the Iranian people.
At the same time, we have a very important question, I think. What will be with oil prices if regime falls?
Again, hard to say. One target that was on the table during the Israeli attack and the US attack, oil installations. And those oil installations were not hit. I'm assuming that in discussions in the White House and perhaps in Israel now, there is the possibility of going after oil installations. The downside is it would disrupt the flow of oil, the production of oil, and have an impact on oil prices. And in that respect, I'm guessing that you're not going to see strikes against oil platforms were there to be an American military operation. I think it would be more strikes against military targets, those forces that are out there in the streets that are killing the protesters. It's also the case that oil prices have been dropping recently, in part because I think there's a sense that more oil from Venezuela is going to be coming online. That having been said, it's clear that Trump's dreams of American companies rushing into Venezuela to pump oil are just dreams, because we're not yet in a situation in which major American oil companies are going into a country that is very unstable and that requires billions of dollars in investment in infrastructure.
But frankly speaking, do you believe in US strike on Iran, or is it just intimidation?
Well, I don't know. I mean, it's a very tough call. Do I believe that strikes against Iran are in active discussion? Yes. Do I believe that the Trump administration feels empowered by the success of its strikes so far, and in particular, the strikes against Iran's nuclear facilities, the surgical operation to remove Maduro from power without the loss of a single American life, surgical strikes against ISIS targets in the Middle East? I think there's a sense that the United States can and should use military power to shape outcomes. But I also think that there is justifiable concern about what happens if the United States intervenes in Iran, and what happens if regime change is somehow seen as having American fingerprints on it. So, if this unrest continues, if the killing continues, my best guess is that the United States will use force. But that is just a guess. I am just speculating on the likely outcome.
Yeah, I got you. What is Trump's true desire when it comes to Greenland? Because Denmark is a member of NATO, and its security is warranted by NATO. So all Trump's words that he wants to protect Greenland from China or Russia sound weird.
Weird, I think, is putting it very nicely. I would say that what we're hearing about Greenland is otherworldly. It is completely bizarre. How do I understand Trump and Greenland and his re-invocation of the Monroe Doctrine? I think in many respects, Trump is a 19th century American president. And that if you put Trump in the broad swath of American history, he belongs among those like James Polk and William McKinley and others who believed in manifest destiny and the use of American force for territorial acquisition. And he talked about manifest destiny, Trump did, in his second inaugural address. And so when I hear Trump talk about Greenland, it reminds me of James Polk in the 1840s annexing Texas and then taking a big chunk of Mexico. It reminds me of the United States during the long 19th century expanding westward to the Pacific. It reminds me of the era after the Civil War when the United States bought Alaska and thought about getting Greenland. It reminds me of 1898 when the United States picked a war with Spain and then took over Cuba and Puerto Rico and the Philippines. And so in some ways, I think Trump is looking at a map. He's thinking that, oh, Greenland is close, it's big, it's about the size of 25% of the American landmass, the contiguous 48 states. And he would say, this is my legacy. This is what I want on my tombstone. He added Greenland to the United States. Is there a kind of strategic rationale? Yes and no. Yes, in the sense that Greenland matters strategically. Yes, in the sense that there are minerals there. But the U.S. can get everything it wants under the current situation. It has a 1951 agreement. It has a base, Patuxent base, which is used as a place for the monitoring of missile launches for low Earth satellites. It is important to controlling what's called the Greenland, Iceland, UK gap. So the United States doesn't need to own Greenland to deal with its strategic interests. And as a consequence, I find it very hard to contemplate why Trump would talk about the use of military force, which would effectively mean an armed attack against a NATO ally, which would effectively mean the end of NATO and the Atlantic Alliance.
Yeah, actually, my next question will be about this topic, because let's imagine that Trump annexes Greenland or forces Denmark to sell the island to USA. What would it mean for global security architecture, and how autocracies around the world perceive this precedent?
You know, I can imagine a situation in which Greenland one day becomes part of the United States, or it ends up in a status similar to territories that are part of the United States but not in the Union. But that's going to take a long time, and it needs to occur consensually. And the idea that somehow Trump is going to hold a gun to the head of Greenlanders and to the head of Danish government, and they're going to say, oh yes, Mr. Trump, we want to join the United States, we're going to sell you Greenland, it's not going to happen. And as a consequence, I have a hard time imagining what the end game is here. And I don't believe, it's hard for me to really believe that if there isn't a decision by Greenland and Denmark for Greenland to be bought by the United States, that Trump would then resort to military force. Now Trump does weird things, as you put it. Trump is unpredictable. Trump has broken the mold of post-World War II American foreign policy. Trump doesn't seem to care about international law or domestic law. But attacking an ally, going to war against Denmark, against Greenland, perhaps other European countries would join in to defend Greenland. It's just difficult to imagine. And I think it really would mean the effective end of a stable international order anchored by the United States. And it's hard for me to imagine that any ally of the United States, whether it is Japan or South Korea or Germany or France or Denmark, would remain in an alliance if they think the United States has returned to the path of imperial conquest.